Hello there. In this episode of our World War II special series, we are going to be looking at the Balkan Wars. The First Balkan War saw Yugoslavia disintegrate, with Serbia being victorious. However, the Second Balkan War is where things get interesting. The focus of this war was Kosovo and Bosnia, and although it is called the Kosovo Conflict, we will be looking at both conflicts. It's time to take a look at the US-led NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. Now, if you would like to request an episode of our World War II series or any other subject, then check the link in the description below. The 20th century was not kind to Yugoslavia. The country had been involved in 2 world wars, and during the Cold War it found itself split into 2 separate states. Then, in the early 1990s, the nation fractured. The collapse of Yugoslavia was a brutal affair. Not only did the country fall apart, but there was also a lot of fighting. There were 7 Yugoslav wars in total, the first of which was the war in Slovenia. Now this war was not very intense, and it ended rather quickly. The next 6 wars all took place at the same time, and the area where most of the fighting happened was the Balkans. The main protagonist in these wars was Serbia, who were trying to keep Yugoslavia together. But Serbia wasn't alone. They were aided by Montenegro, Republika Srpska, and several paramilitary groups. On the opposite side, you have Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, who wanted independence. Kosovo was technically part of Serbia, but had its own desires to be an independent state. Croatia and Bosnia declared their independence at pretty much the same time. This led to the Croatian War of Independence and the Bosnian War. Serbia did not want to lose Bosnia. Why? Well, Bosnia was mostly Serbian. About 48% of the population was Serbian. So what Serbia was doing was preventing an ethnic cleanse. The Serbs didn't want the Serbian people living in Bosnia to become a Croatian state. However, the Bosnian Serbs were fighting against the Bosnian government. This led to a lot of atrocities committed by all sides. The worst one was the Srebrenica massacre, where some 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered by Bosnian Serb forces. Now, whilst all this was going on, there was also a conflict over the region of Kosovo. Kosovo was a province of Serbia, but the Albanians living there wanted independence from Serbia. And so the Kosovo War began. Now, this conflict was more complicated than just Serbia versus the Kosovo Albanians. It seems that the Kosovo Albanians were fighting for independence, but in reality, they were fighting for unification with Albania. In fact, in 1991, the president of Albania stated that Kosovo was the unfinished business of the Albanian people. So Kosovo was important to Albania, because it was mostly populated by ethnic Albanians, and the plan was for Kosovo to unify with Albania. As we can see, this conflict was bigger than just Kosovo. So what happens next? Well, as the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo progressed, things were getting worse and worse. Civilians were being bombed, killed, and tortured. It seemed as though no peace agreement would be made, and so NATO got involved. Now, NATO is a North Atlantic treaty organization. Its main purpose was to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. However, after the dissolution of the USSR, NATO had no purpose. To make things worse, many people felt as though NATO had outlived its usefulness, and so wanted their country to withdraw from the alliance. This meant that NATO needed something else to do, and so NATO decided to intervene in the Yugoslav wars. Now, it wasn't just NATO who wanted to stop the Yugoslav wars. The United Nations Security Council passed a number of resolutions demanding a ceasefire between the Yugoslav republics. When these failed, the US proposed a resolution that authorized NATO to use force to stop the violence. NATO airstrikes would soon be coming. On March 24, 1999, NATO began airstrikes against Yugoslavia. These attacks caught the Yugoslavs off guard. Serbia had expected an attack from NATO sooner or later, but not at this point. They thought that NATO would intervene in Kosovo, but not bomb the whole country. Before the bombing began, Milosevic ordered all able-bodied men to report for military duty. Serbia was unprepared for the NATO intervention. Their air defenses were obsolete, and their pilots lacked experience, so Yugoslavia was quickly losing the air war. But how did America contribute to the NATO intervention? Well, America was vital to the success of NATO. After all, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. America was a founding member and largest contributor to NATO. This meant that America had a large amount of influence over NATO. America's main contribution to NATO was its air power. The United States sent B-52 bombers from Britain and Germany. All of these planes dropped bombs on Yugoslavia. America also contributed 13,500 troops to the ground war. Also, without the United States, NATO would not have intervened in the first place. After all, the US led NATO. As the bombing continued, the Serbian and Montenegrin governments believed that Russia would intervene. Perhaps Russia would scare NATO off, or maybe even join the fight. But this never happened. Russia was not interested in going to war with NATO over some obscure piece of land. Instead, Russia tried to broker a peace deal between NATO and Yugoslavia. By May, it looked as though negotiations were going well. Serbia agreed to withdraw its soldiers from Kosovo and allow KFOR, NATO's peacekeeping force, to enter. Soon after, Russian and KFOR troops entered Kosovo. And with that, the war was over. At least, that's what everyone thought. The United Nations had a plan for Kosovo. They would run the province until such time that elections could be held. And so the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo, or UNMIK, was born. The leader of this administration was Bernard Kouchner, a French politician. Kosovo was under the control of the United Nations and NATO, but who was in charge? Well, this is quite a complicated question. You see, the United Nations was in charge. UNMIK was the civil administration. KFOR was the military force. And then there was OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They had a mission in Kosovo too. It was called the Kosovo Verification Mission, or KVM. KVM was supposed to monitor the withdrawal of Serbian forces and to oversee the demilitarization of Serbia. And then finally, we have the European Union. The EU had a police force in Kosovo called EULEX. Their job was to help rebuild the justice system. But who was in charge of all of these organizations? Which one was the most powerful? Well, essentially, it was the United Nations, but it was really the countries that made up the United Nations. In particular, it was America and France who had the most influence. In June 1999, a meeting was held in Bonn. It was here that the future of Kosovo was discussed. The main topic was the provisional institutions of self-government for Kosovo. Essentially, the provisional institutions were the government of Kosovo. It was agreed that Kosovo would be run by a governor who would be appointed by the United Nations. Kosovo would also have a parliament. The parliament would consist of 120 seats. 100 of those seats would be elected by the people of Kosovo, and 20 would be appointed by the United Nations. In the meantime, preparations were being made for the arrival of the United Nations and NATO. In July 1999, the mayor of Pristina ordered the construction of a prison for the remaining Serbian forces. He believed that the Serbs would destroy Kosovo before leaving, and so he wanted to imprison them.